Morning came quietly to Red Hollow, as if the town itself was careful not to wake too suddenly. A pale light stretched over the rooftops, touching the edges of wooden signs and dusty windows. The air was cool for a brief moment before the heat of the day would settle in again. Shop doors creaked open one by one, boots stepped onto porches, and the slow rhythm of daily life resumed. But something was different. People were watching. Not openly, never openly, but with quick glances and hushed tones. Their attention drifted, again and again, to the same place. The bench outside the general store. The three girls were still there. They hadn't left. The youngest was curled against her sisters, still half asleep, her head resting in the middle one's lap. The middle sister gently brushed strands of hair from the child's face, her movements slow and careful. The oldest sat upright, her posture stiff from the long night, her eyes scanning the street as if searching for an answer that hadn't come. They looked smaller in the morning light, more fragile, more real. A man across the street paused while sweeping his storefront. He leaned on his broom, staring for a moment too long before catching himself. With a quick shake of his head, he resumed sweeping harder now, as though he could brush the sight away along with the dust. Inside the general store, the shopkeeper stood behind the counter, pretending to reorganize jars that didn't need moving. Every so often, he glanced out the window. "They're still there," a woman murmured from near the doorway. "I can see that," he replied quietly. She hesitated. "Someone ought to—" "No," he cut in, sharper than he intended. He lowered his voice, glancing toward the door. "Best not to start something we can't finish." The woman frowned, her hands tightening around the edge of her shawl. "They're just children." "I know what they are," he said, softer now. "That's not the point." But neither of them said what the point actually was. Out on the street, two men stood near the hitching post, speaking in low voices. "Word travels fast," one of them muttered. "You help them, people start asking questions. And questions bring trouble," the other added. They both fell silent after that, their eyes drifting toward the girls. It wasn't cruelty that kept them still. It was something quieter, something heavier. Fear not of the girls, but of what helping them might cost. In a town like Red Hollow, where every decision carried weight and every misstep could echo for years, people learned to stay within the lines, to mind their own business, to keep their lives steady and predictable, even when it meant looking away. The oldest girl stood after a while, brushing the dust from her dress. She glanced down at her sisters, then across the street, gathering what little courage she had left. "Stay here," she said gently. "I'll be right back." The middle sister nodded, though worry flickered in her eyes. The girl crossed the street slowly, approaching a small bakery tucked between two larger buildings. The smell of fresh bread lingered faintly in the air, warm and inviting. Inside, a baker stood behind the counter, pulling a tray from the oven. "Sir," she began, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest, "I was wondering if you might need help today. I can clean, carry things, anything at all." The baker paused. He looked at her, really looked this time. At the dust on her shoes, the determination in her eyes, the quiet hope she was trying so hard to hold on to. For a moment, it seemed like he might say yes. But then his gaze shifted toward the window, toward the street, toward the unseen weight pressing in from all sides. "I can't," he said at last, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry." The words landed softly, but they felt final. The girl nodded once, swallowing hard. "Thank you anyway." She turned and stepped back out into the sunlight. Across the street, her sisters watched her return. The youngest had woken now, her small face filled with questions she didn't ask. The oldest sat beside them again, forcing a small smile. "It's all right," she said. "We'll try somewhere else." But they didn't move. Not right away, because deep down they were beginning to understand. This wasn't about finding the right door. It was about doors that wouldn't open at all. Time passed slowly. A few more attempts were made quiet. Conversations, polite refusals, kind eyes that didn't turn into helping hands. Each one chipped away at hope, little by little, until even the strongest among them felt it slipping. Still, they stayed, because there was nowhere else to go. By midday, the sun hung high, casting sharp shadows across the ground. The heat returned, pressing down on the town like a weight no one could shrug off. And then, from the far end of the road, a faint sound broke through the stillness. Hoofbeats, slow, steady, unhurried. At first, no one paid much attention. Travelers came and went from time to time. But this one was different. The rhythm didn't change. It didn't rush or falter. The rider came into view through the haze of dust, a lone figure against the bright horizon. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, his posture relaxed but purposeful. His horse moved with an easy confidence, as though the road itself welcomed him forward. He didn't look around much as he entered the town, didn't call out or slow down to greet anyone. But as he passed the general store, his gaze shifted just slightly, toward the bench, toward the three girls, and unlike everyone else, he didn't look away. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent, softening the sharp edges of Red Hollow. The heat eased just enough to let the town breathe again. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the golden light gave everything a quieter, calmer feel. The three girls still sat near the general store, but something had changed. They no longer looked quite as lost. The bread was nearly gone, the water shared carefully between them. The youngest leaned against her sisters with a faint, sleepy smile, her hunger no longer pressing quite so hard. The middle sister seemed more at ease, her shoulders relaxed for the first time since they'd arrived. A small act had made a difference, but evening was coming, and with it, the question. They hadn't answered yet. Where would they sleep? He hadn't lingered too close after giving them food, but he hadn't left either. From time to time, his gaze drifted back toward the bench, not in a way that drew attention, but enough to keep them in sight. He understood something the town didn't seem ready to face. Food solved one problem. Night would bring another. After a moment, he finished with the saddle and walked back toward the girls. They noticed him immediately this time. The oldest straightened slightly. "Sir?" she said, unsure if he meant to speak again. He stopped a few steps away, the same careful distance as before. "Sun's going down," he said simply. "You got somewhere to stay?" The question settled quietly between them. The middle sister looked down. The youngest tightened her hold on her sleeve. The oldest shook her head. "No," she admitted. The cowboy nodded once, as if confirming what he already suspected. He glanced briefly down the street, then back at them. "All right," he said. "Come on." The girls exchanged uncertain looks. "Where?" the middle sister asked. "Someplace dry," he replied. That was all he offered. No promises, no long explanations, just a direction. After a brief hesitation, the oldest stood, picking up the worn suitcase. The other two followed close behind her. There was still caution in their steps, but also a small, growing trust. The cowboy led them down the street, past the row of shops and toward the quieter edge of town. Fewer people lingered there. Fewer eyes followed. At the far end stood old wooden stable. It had clearly been used once long ago, but now it sat mostly forgotten. The paint had faded, the doors slightly crooked on their hinges. One side leaned just enough to show its age, and a loose board shifted gently in the breeze. The cowboy stepped up to the door and pushed it open. It creaked loudly, breaking the stillness. Inside, the space was dim but not dark. Faded light slipped through the cracks in the wood, casting soft lines across the floor. The air smelled of dry hay and dust, but it was clean enough, just unused. The girls hesitated at the entrance. "It's not much," the cowboy said, glancing around, "but it'll keep the wind off." He stepped inside without waiting, setting to work as if the place already belonged to the moment. He moved an old crate aside, cleared a patch of floor, and pulled together what hay remained into a small, softer pile. The girls watched in silence. No one had told him to do this. No one had asked. Yet he worked steadily, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After a few minutes, he stepped back, brushing his hands together. "That'll do for now," he said. It wasn't even close, but it was shelter, and tonight that was enough. "Thank you," she said quietly. The cowboy nodded once, then reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a worn blanket. He set it down gently on the hay. "Gets cold at night?" he said. The middle sister stepped forward this time. "You don't have to." "I know," he replied. That ended the discussion. Outside, the sky had begun to turn shades of orange and deep blue. The first lanterns flickered to life back in town, their glow soft and distant. From afar, a few townspeople had followed just enough to see where they were going. They stood at a distance now, watching. "He's setting them up out there," one man muttered. "In the old stable? Looks like it." A pause. "Well, at least it's not in town," another said, though his voice lacked conviction. The woman with the laundry stood among them, her eyes fixed on the scene. This time, she didn't turn away. Back inside the stable, the girls settled in. The youngest curled up first, already half asleep again. The middle sister sat beside her, adjusting the blanket gently. The oldest remained standing for a moment longer, looking at the cowboy. "You didn't even ask who we are," she said. He paused near the door, glancing back. "Didn't seem necessary," he replied. She frowned slightly. "What if we're trouble?" A faint hint of a smile touched his expression, not amused, just knowing. "Then you'd already be causing it," he said. The answer caught her off guard. She didn't have a reply. The cowboy stepped outside, resting one hand briefly on the door. "You'll be all right here," he said. "I'll be nearby." And with that, he pulled the door mostly closed, leaving just enough space for fresh air and light. Inside, the girls sat in the quiet. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, they weren't out in the open. They weren't being watched from every direction. They weren't alone on a bench with nowhere to go. It wasn't much, but it was enough to feel safe. And out in the fading light, the town of Red Hollow stood a little quieter than before, not because nothing had changed, but because something had. By the next morning, Red Hollow didn't feel quite the same. Nothing obvious had changed. The same buildings stood in place, the same dust drifted lazily across the street, and the same routines carried on. But beneath it all, something subtle had shifted, like a door that had been closed for too long was finally beginning to open. It started with small things. The oldest girl arrived early at the supply shop, sweeping the wooden floor before the shopkeeper even asked. She worked quietly, carefully, making sure every shelf was straight, every item in place. The man watched her for a while, arms crossed, as if waiting for a reason to regret his decision, but none came. Instead, he found himself stepping aside, giving her room to move. "You missed a spot," he said at one point, gesturing toward a corner. She nodded immediately and fixed it. No argument. No hesitation. By mid-morning, he was no longer watching her as closely. Across the street, the middle sister carried water again, her steps more confident now. The bucket didn't wobble in her hands the way it had the day before. A few townsfolk moved around her without that same careful avoidance, they still noticed her. But now, they didn't step away. Near the bakery, the youngest sat on a crate, her feet swinging gently. She wore one of the dresses the woman had given her, still a little too big, but clean and bright compared to what she'd worn before. She held a small piece of bread, nibbling slowly, savoring it. The baker stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. Then, without saying anything, he stepped back inside and returned with another piece, slightly larger this time. He set it beside her on the crate. "For later," he said gruffly. The girl looked up at him, surprised. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once and went back inside as though it had been nothing at all, but it wasn't nothing, not anymore. Further down the street, the woman with the laundry approached the middle sister as she passed. "Those clothes, do they fit all right?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," the girl replied. "They're perfect." The woman hesitated, then gave a small smile. "I've got a few more you can look through later," she said. "If you'd like." "I would." The girl answered, her voice brighter now. Again, no big moment, just a quiet offering, and a quiet acceptance. At the edge of town, near the old stable, the cowboy worked alone. He had repaired part of the fence that morning, replacing a loose board and securing it firmly into place. Nearby, he stacked a few extra bundles of hay, bringing some order to what had once been neglected. He didn't do it for recognition. In fact, no one had asked him to do it at all, but his actions carried the same steady message as before. If something needed doing, you did it. Without waiting, without asking who should go first. As the day wore on, more of these small moments unfolded. A stable hand showed the middle sister how to tie a proper knot, guiding her hands patiently until she got it right. "Like this," he said. "You'll get the hang of it." She smiled when she finally did. At the shop, the oldest girl finished her tasks early. The shopkeeper noticed. "You can come back tomorrow," he said, almost casually. "If you want." Her eyes widened slightly. "I'd like that," she replied. He nodded, turning away quickly, as though the decision hadn't taken any thought at all. By afternoon, the three girls crossed paths again near the center of town. Didn't rush to each other this time. They didn't need to. There was no panic, no urgency, just a quiet understanding that they were each finding their place, piece by piece. The youngest held up her extra bread proudly. The middle sister showed the knot she'd learned. The oldest shared the news about the shop. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, their conversation carried something new. Hope. Across the street, a few townsfolk watched them, not with suspicion, but with something closer to reflection. "They seem all right," one man admitted. "They always were," another replied. After a pause, "The difference now was not in the girls. It was in how the town chose to see them." Near the hitching post, the cowboy stood beside his horse once more, his gaze calm as ever. He didn't interrupt the moment, didn't step in to guide or direct. He simply watched because this part didn't belong to him anymore. The change wasn't his to control. It belonged to the town. And slowly, steadily, Red Hollow was remembering what it meant to care. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting its warm glow over the street, the town felt lighter. The silence that once held it back had softened, replaced not by loud voices or grand gestures, but by something quieter. Something stronger. People were beginning to choose differently. And sometimes that was all it took. Just a few small choices to remind a place who it used to be. The morning the cowboy left, Red Hollow woke to a sky brushed in soft gold and pale blue. It was the kind of sunrise that didn't ask for attention, yet quietly transformed everything it touched. The buildings, once dull and worn, seemed warmer. In the early light, the dust along the road shimmered faintly, no longer just a sign of neglect. But part of something lived in something real. The town stirred gently. A shop door opened. A broom swept across a wooden porch. Somewhere a kettle began to whistle, and near the edge of town, by the old stable, the three girls were already awake. They had settled into a rhythm now. The oldest stepped outside first, stretching slightly, as she took in the morning air. Her gaze instinctively swept the horizon, not with worry this time, but with habit. She had learned to stay aware, to stay ready. But today, there was no tightness in her chest, only calm, behind her, the middle. Sister folded the blanket neatly, placing it on the crate they now used as a table. She moved with purpose, with confidence that hadn't been there just days ago. The youngest followed soon after, stepping into the sunlight with a quiet smile. She held a small piece of bread in her hand, saved from the day before, and took a careful bite, as if savoring not just the food, but the moment itself. It was simple, but it was enough. The oldest glanced toward the fence where the cowboy usually stood. He wasn't there. She frowned slightly. Stepping a little further out, her eyes scanning the area. Nothing. Just the quiet stretch of land beyond the town. At the hitching post, one space stood empty. Understanding came slowly. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she walked a few steps forward, her gaze fixed on the distant road leading away from Red Hollow. And there, just barely visible against the horizon, was a familiar figure, a rider, moving steadily away. The middle sister joined her, following her line of sight. "Is he leaving?" she asked softly. The oldest nodded. Double quotes, yes. The youngest stepped closer, squinting into the distance. "Should we go after him?" she asked. The question hung in the air. For a moment, it might have seemed like the right thing to do. To run after the man who had helped them. To say thank you one more time. To ask him to stay. But the oldest shook her head. "No," she said gently. "Why not?" The youngest asked. The middle sister answered this time, her voice quiet but certain. "Because he already gave us what we needed." The youngest looked between them, then back toward the fading figure. Slowly, she nodded. The three of them stood there for a while, watching as the cowboy grew smaller against the rising sun until he disappeared completely beyond the horizon. There was no goodbye. No final wave. Just a quiet leaving, and somehow that felt right. Behind them, the town of Red Hollow was already awake. The shopkeeper stood outside his store, adjusting a display near the entrance. When he saw the girls, he gave a small nod. "Morning," he called. "Morning," the oldest replied. "You coming in today?" he asked. She smiled slightly. "Yes, sir." Across the street, the baker stepped out with a fresh tray in hand. "Got something warm if you're hungry," he said. Glancing toward the youngest. Her face lit up. "Thank you." Nearby, the woman with the laundry waved them over. "Got those extra clothes ready," she said. "Come take a look when you have time." The middle sister nodded eagerly. "I will." The town moved around them, not avoiding, not watching from a distance, but including them in its rhythm. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't sudden. But it was real. The girls turned back toward the stable one last time before heading into town. It no longer felt like a place they were stuck in. It felt like a beginning. As they walked down the street together, their steps were lighter, more certain. They weren't just passing through anymore. They were becoming part of something. And though the cowboy was gone, his presence hadn't truly left. It lingered in the open doors. In the small acts of kindness. In the way people now chose to look at one another. The oldest paused for just a moment, glancing back toward the horizon where he had disappeared. A soft smile touched her face, not out of sadness, but gratitude, because she understood now what he had given them, not just food, not just shelter, but a chance, a beginning they could carry forward on their own. She turned back toward the town. her sisters at her side. Dot, and together they walked on no longer as strangers in a silent place, but as part of a story that would keep going, one small act at a time.